Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Today we're exploring better ways to speak. And as an example of that, I'm going to share with you two of my favorite podcasts. The first one is called Betty in the Sky with a Suitcase. And Betty is an air hostess, and in her podcast, she always shares amusing, funny, and dark stories about the airline industry and who she meets. She's a lovely lady, but when she gets excited, she doesn't have good rhythm in her speech. And I'm going to play you a few examples. One of her speaking not so well because she's a bit excited, and the other one when she's speaking really well. You'll see that in my first example, she kind of crushes the words together a little bit, and she doesn't give them all the same respect. But in the second one, she's telling a story in typical American English. Still a little bit hard to catch some of the words, but it's much better than the first clip. So let's begin with Betty in the Sky with a Suitcase, and you can find her podcast online. She's a very famous podcaster and very bitter and cynical. Okay, so let's have a little listen.
This story is right in time for Father's Day. So we're boarding a flight to Europe, and this black family, mother, father, and 4 kids, 4 boys and an infant daughter, board the plane. And those boys, actually 3 of us mentioned it. They were the most polite children we had seen in ages. They just were so engaged and thoughtful and making eye contact. Nice kids. So then the father comes up and says, we're boarding. We have like 12 minutes before departure. 12 minutes before departure. And he goes, can I run to McDonald's? And we're like, no. And he's like, yeah, but my kids are hungry. And we're like, yeah, well, McDonald's is, first of all, you're not allowed to leave the plane once you get on an international flight. And second of all, McDonald's is like in the middle. It's a ways down the concourse and has a really long line. If you go to McDonald's, your wife and 4 kids are going to Europe by themselves. So the one...
Right, so you can hear there that she started speaking with using some really big gaps there, and the children were... And then she seemed to kind of stop. I think that's natural for people maybe who are reading from a script. They start and stop and they need a moment to think. Or it could be she was just getting her ideas together there. But the first few moments there of that podcast were a little bit uncomfortable. She started off really well, and then she kind of just like stopped for a few seconds, as I just did, and you can hear that it's clear that something else is happening there. I'm not sure if she was distracted, if she was looking around. I have to say that she did do very well, though. I mean, even with that distraction, she still sounded good, but it could just be bad editing. But my point is, when you do that with people, it can be a little bit uncomfortable. It's not really the best way to speak in a podcast, because you want to have a rhythm flowing. You want to make people feel at ease when you're talking, and you do that by stretching across the words. Let's have a listen now at Betty when she's telling a usual story without these things. Now, just to warn you, Betty, her stories, being American, of course, her stories can be very positive. And the next one is about a guy who feels that he must raise his children well because, of course, they are the future. Yeah, very not British, that. A very positive kind of attitude. So let's listen to her as she tells this story and notice her spacing. And she's feeling a little bit more relaxed with this next story. So let's listen to it.
goes, "Can I run to McDonald's?" And we're like, "No." And he's like, "Yeah, but my kids are hungry." And we're like, "Yeah, well, McDonald's is, first of all, you're not allowed to leave the plane once you get on an international flight. And second of all, McDonald's is like in the middle. It's a ways down the concourse. It has a really long line. If you go to McDonald's, your wife and 4 kids are going to Europe by themselves." So the one girl goes, of course you feel bad when someone says their kids are hungry. So she's like, "I'll go to the back and I'll get you a bag of snacks and I'll bring it for the kids." So we take off. And after the service, this father comes up with the 4-month-old baby, and she's crying, and he's trying to get her to go to sleep. So he's in the galley bouncing the baby girl, and we were chatting, and I really enjoyed talking with him. And then he says, we're basically talking about parenting, and I was questioning why you'd go to Europe with 4 children. And he was like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Well, people don't usually do that because, you've got an infant and 3 kids, and they're not exactly going to want to look at statues and go to museums in Europe." And it turned out he was visiting family. That makes total sense. And he was saying how important he thought it was for them to be around the language and the culture. And then he said, "Here, I'm going to show you some magic." And he takes the baby girl and he cradles her in his arms lengthwise. And he's got these big arms and these big hands. And he starts rocking the baby back and forth while he's bouncing up and down. He's like now put a child to sleep human machine. He's bouncing and he's rocking and he's bouncing and he's rocking, and he's got these big hands and these big arms, and I could just see that the baby felt so safe in the big hands and the big arms. And he said, at one point she's going to start making these noises like he said the boys didn't do this, but she does, and then she'll make those noises and then she'll go to sleep. And I said, "Oh, you're such a good father." And he said, "I don't have a choice." And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "I have to be a good father." He said, "This affects many generations to come." He said, "My children are going to have good parents, so they'll know what it's like to be a good parent, and they will be good parents to their children, and their children will know what it's like to have good parents, and they will be good parents to their children." He said, "So this affects many generations." And then the baby did this little like and went to sleep, and I was like, now that is a good dad.
Yeah, a very not British story there. We British people, we don't often talk in that way about being good people and thinking about generations to come to save our country. Yeah. Anyway, it is a very funny podcast, and she is a very funny lady. Her next story after this one, unfortunately, is not repeatable on this podcast because it's a little bit rude. But I do recommend you visit her website. Betty in the Sky with a Suitcase. She has a website, and then she has her podcast. Her podcast direct link is betty.libsyn.com. That's Libsyn. Libsyn.com. Okay, so that was my first example. And just to very quickly give you a second example, we're going to listen to Alistair Cook's letter from America. Alistair Cook was a journalist who lived in America, and he sent audio letters to the BBC from the 1940s all the way up to his death in 2001. And he was a really old English gentleman, always making sarcastic comments about American life and culture. His podcast is a wonderful tribute to podcasting, I suppose, because he was one of the first ones. And I think you can now get his episodes as podcasts. Of course, they were originally broadcast on state radio. You can find them all on the BBC Sound Archive. If you just put in Letter from America, Alistair Cooke, you'll find his podcasts. And here he is with one of his shows, and you can hear his voice.
With all this talk about guns, there is now a likelihood that at long last the Congress will pass the so-called Brady Bill, the first federal attempt to control guns. Mr. Brady was President Reagan's press secretary when, in the spring of 1981, pistol shots from a demented young man wounded the president and 3 others. Mr. Brady suffered brain damage and has been paralyzed ever since. But ever since also, he and his wife have labored against the opposition of 6 Congresses to fashion a gun control bill. It is a very modest proposal, in the main requiring people wanting to buy a gun to wait 5 days till their past has been looked into. People for and against gun control have pointed out for years that anyone intending to commit a murder, or even to possess a weapon as an intimidating cover for a burglary, is the last sort of person who is going to wait 5 days or even to put in an application. I think that once such a bill is passed, or even one much more stringent, there's a good chance of a repeat performance of the social calamity that followed on the passage of the Prohibition Amendment to the Constitution. That was ratified in 1919 and became law 1 year later. It was called at the time the Noble Experiment, though pretty soon it became painfully clear it did not endow Americans with more nobility than they already had. People who'd never drunk were tempted to try the forbidden fruit, and to the amazement and then the despair of the general population, a whole underground industry arrived to bottle and provide the fruit. It spawned, of course, the whole savage and squalid era of the bootleggers, the emergence.
Right, so that was Alistair Cooke's Letter from America. Now you can hear there that he's an older man, so he's a lot of breathing in there, and they also haven't taken the time to edit him. These days, radio broadcasts would be heavily polished. It's easy to notice his intonation. He did leave quite a bit of space between his words there. But again, I think it's because of his age. We don't really hear those kinds of things now. His intonation was very interesting, and his stress as well. He's very royal in his presentation. He's not really showing too much emotion there, but when he gets excited, he really does speak very, very well. A little bit different from Betty, but I think in both these examples they were reading. But his received pronunciation, and he's one of the few people that I remember who actually used it, comes from the fact that before 1990, everyone in the public eye, in the broadcasting world, had to use received pronunciation, or at least have a southern accent to resemble the Queen. So you weren't allowed to have regional accents back then. But anyway, he became something of an icon within the BBC. So I think even if he presented a badly recorded edition, no one was going to care. And incidentally, just another note, he was talking about gun control, which is a big topic today, of course. It seems that the debate hasn't gone away. That was a YouTube clip from the 10th of December 1993. Well, I hope you've enjoyed these clips. Let's talk again soon, and do check out these podcasts. They are very, very interesting for two very, very different reasons. Okay, see you and thanks again. Bye bye.